Britain had a duty to show Syria hadn't got away with using chemical weapons.
There were 3 particular sites that were struck. We hope that that has degraded his capability, but at the very least what it has done is sent a signal that the world won't tolerate the continual erosion of the taboo against chemical weapons and the psychological boundary that there should be in people's minds about the use of such weapons needs to be restored. It's been there for 100 years. There were no battlefield chemical weapons used at all during the Second World War, one of the most brutal conflicts humanity has ever seen. But we're now seeing it creeping up in the early years of the 21st century. Time for the world to say no, and that's what we've done.
Let's get more reaction on the Syrian airstrikes. Here is our senior political correspondent, Jason Farrell at Westminster.
There are very few sort of cast-iron justifications for acts of aggression against another country. One is self-defence, as he pointed out, and one is to get the mandate from the UN for that action. In other words, all the main nations have signed up to that form of aggression, and therefore you're almost justified in going ahead because you have that backing of the international community. The other justification, the justification that the UK has used, is to assist humanitarian suffering and to alleviate humanitarian suffering. And under those circumstances, there are very strict guidelines around how that should be done, that there should be no other means of doing it, and that it must be a very short, sharp, proportionate response. And the government say that they have met all those guidelines, but effectively, Jeremy Corbyn's saying, but also you should have a UN sanction for that kind of response. And this is debatable. And therefore, he says, should go to Parliament, should at the very least, have consulted Parliament ahead of doing this. That's the point he makes. But others have made the point that the UN is log-jammed. It's not going anywhere on this Syria question because Russia have been vetoing various forms of action since the conflict began. And even some of his own MPs accept that point. And I think that we will hear that tomorrow in the Commons. Let's hear from Chuka Umunna. He was speaking about this earlier.
I think taking military action where you have a barbaric regime that has gassed its own people is absolutely the right thing to do. However, I do believe that Parliament should have been consulted first, and that could have easily have happened at the end of this week, and it didn't, and that's regrettable. But ultimately, you cannot have the use of chemical weapons going unanswered by the international community, and I don't believe you should hide behind the inevitable veto of Russia at the UN Security Council. You shouldn't hide behind that veto when there are other legal avenues available to justify taking action to prevent these kinds of atrocity.
Now, I wonder if Chuka Umunna, or whatever his name happens to be, I'm not quite sure, I wonder if he would be in favour of ignoring the American veto, which stops any action being taken against the rogue state of Israel, who are daily slaughtering Palestinian people. And in fact, what's going on here is preparing us to believe that when the next claim about Assad is made, that we would be perfectly justified to go in and do whatever we say is necessary. All of what is being said on this report, if that's what you can call it, I mean, to me it's just a load of propaganda. All they're saying is based on rubbish. They've got absolutely no evidence. They've been trying to pin a chemical attack on Assad for years, and they've never managed it. And even when he gets rid of all his chemical weapons, and the United Nations organization verified that they had been destroyed, on top of which, during another chemical attack, when Assad was so stupid that he chose to carry out a chemical attack, so we were told, at the very moment that a United Nations inspection team turned up on the spot. And the United Nations chief on the spot, Carla Ponti, said outright that in her opinion the attack was carried out by the rebels, not Assad at all. But we'll now hear the chief reporter, who's always sent to the place that has need of the most insidious propaganda necessary, Lisa Holland, reporting from Moscow. where she will deliver an absolute pack of lies which will infer that Assad is responsible for all the deaths that have been caused in Syria because he carried out a civil war. When in fact she knows full well, and so do most of the reporters on Sky News, because people like Stuart Ramsey were on the spot talking to the terrorists that had been armed by the British. And they know full well that the British deliberately provoked what they called a civil war. It was no such thing. It was an attack by mercenaries against a government. Simple as that.
It seems the thrust from Jeremy Corbyn is going to be try to introduce a Powers Act, which would bind the government to coming to Parliament. The SNP, on the other hand, say that they want to look at actually what has happened. They feel that Theresa May should have recalled Parliament last week. They want a debate on whether Parliament does approve this. Let's hear from Nicola Sturgeon.
For the
controls, and added it would be difficult to reach any compromise on Syria in terms of UN resolutions. Well, Sky's Lisa Holland can join us now from Moscow with more on this. And this afternoon too, Vladimir Putin holding talks with his Iranian counterpart today.
Yes, they have spoken on the phone, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, and Hassan Rouhani, the Iranian leader. One expects that the conversation would go along the lines, of course, of talking about the Syrian airstrikes, but also talking about presenting very much a united front. Remember that, of course, Russia and Iran are the two main backers of Syria's leader, President Bashar al-Assad. And on that front, Bashar al-Assad himself has been seen today with Russian MPs in the Syrian capital, Damascus. Now, one MP was quoted on the Interfax news agency here in Moscow as saying that Assad was in very good spirits, that they talked about the economy. But also, I think that at every twist and turn, you hear from Damascus, you hear from Moscow, and you hear from anywhere else that's supporting Bashar al-Assad, saying that it's going to make peace in Syria a lot more difficult to put back together. That, of course, is a lot of people find that very difficult to stomach, given that civil war has been going on since 2011. And if you put aside the issue of chemical weapons, the statistics are that hundreds of thousands of people have been killed at the hands of the president himself because of the conflict, which, of course, has raged on now for such a long time, and that you have got millions who have been displaced internally or have fled the country. So shifting the blame back onto the allies of Britain, America and France for causing more mayhem by carrying out these strikes, I think a lot of people are going to find a bit rich.
What role can Moscow play, if any, in trying to resolve this conflict? It's, in a way, stuck in the middle, isn't it now?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily stuck in the middle, because remember that Russia has put itself in the middle of all of this. It's strategically very important for Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, to have a foothold in Syria. It means he gets an air base, it means he gets a naval base, and he gets a hold on what's going on in the Middle East. It suits him to have Syrian President Bashar al-Assad as his regional partner. But at the same time, in an interview that Maria Zakharova, who is the foreign ministry spokeswoman, gave to our own colleague Dermot Murnahan just a couple of days ago, one of the most interesting lines which came out of that, I think, was her saying, Assad is your guy, he's not our guy. She's saying that he's got cultural ties to the UK, that he was educated in the UK, his wife, of course, is British. So that was kind of putting some distance, in essence, between the Russians and Assad. But I think really he would not still be in power were but for the support he enjoys from Russia, that he's really turned the conflict around.
All right, Lisa, for now, thank you very much indeed.
This woman could well be paid by Israel. What she's attempting to do is build up, generate an idea that Assad should go so that they can reduce Syria to exactly the same level as they've already done in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Yemen, in Iraq. In fact, they've done it all across the Middle East. And they will not be satisfied until they've done it to Syria. They've come up against a full stop in Syria. And they cannot stand it. They will blame anybody. It's Russia, it's Iran, it doesn't matter who. They will never mention the fact that they are in full support of what Saudi Arabia are doing in Yemen with British weapons. That is off the board. You mustn't ever mention that. They'll never mention the fact that Israel has used illegal chemical weapons in Palestine. They'll never mention that. They talk about Assad and all his problems, all the things that he is alleged to have done. Nothing has ever been proven against him. Absolutely nothing. Just as they never proved anything against Gaddafi. You have people coming out with clutches of photographs in their hand and look at all these photos, look at all these photos, all these people were killed by Assad. And we had exactly the same routine in Libya with Gaddafi. And it's all filmed by Sky News and all presented to present Gaddafi as a very bad man, and he must go.
That's an important point, isn't it? Russia came into its involvement in Syria, and that, as Lisa was mentioning there, without support, Assad wouldn't be effectively winning the war there.
No, absolutely. Russia has supported and propped up the Assad regime, which to some extent is almost a puppet regime. It wouldn't be there if it wasn't for Russia military support. And they have pretended that they've been in there to attack terrorist groups like Islamic State, but if you look at their bombing patterns right from the beginning, they were going after enemies of Assad. They've been supporting the Assad regime and giving them diplomatic cover as well, most importantly in New York, where in the UN Security Council they've blocked every attempt to try and investigate the use of chemical weapons and punish Syria for the use of chemical weapons, making them accomplices, arguably, in the use of those outrageous weapons against the Syrian people. So I think in that light, for Jeremy Corbyn to say that there's a need to go to this UN Security Council, many people, I think, probably outside of Britain as well, are scratching their heads and wondering, does he not understand quite how gridlocked Russia makes those efforts? Now, today, obviously, is Sunday, so we've had Sunday talk shows on both sides of the Atlantic. Here we have politicians, opposition politicians, trying to distinguish themselves from the government, saying they support, in some cases, the use of military action, but saying that there needs to be more legality around the more use of parliamentary scrutiny. On the other side of the Atlantic, the debate has been, in the talk shows, not just so much about Syria, but also the latest twists and turns of the Trump investigation saga. So Donald Trump seems to be particularly prickly today in his mood and demonstrating very thin skin and taking issue with the use of the criticism, at least, that the media is giving his use of the term mission accomplished. This is a tweet he put out earlier today saying the Syrian raid was so perfectly carried out with such precision that the only way the fake news media could demean was by my use of the term mission accomplished. I knew they would seize on this, but felt it is such a great military term, it should be brought back. Use often, exclamation mark. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's as if he's not aware of the fact that a previous president, George W. Bush, used that term on an aircraft carrier after the end of the Iraq conflict as he saw it, and then presumably regretted it for years to come because the mission was not accomplished and arguably still isn't today in some ways. So an extraordinary tweet amongst many others from Donald Trump. Meanwhile, his administration officials are also having to defend this use of military action in terms of its legality, less so on the other side of the Atlantic, but we asked Heather Nauert, a State Department spokesperson, how the administration did justify what happened in terms of airstrikes against Syria.
Bashar al-Assad, for far too long, has killed innocent men, women, and children. And it's our responsibility as the international community to act. Russia has failed to do so. Iran continues to cause destabilizing activities in Syria. And then Syria, of course, continues to kill its own people. So we came together and said to the world that we have to act and we have to stop this. The United States, Britain, and France, responsible allies, showing Bashar al-Assad that he has to stop. We will defend the rights of his people even when he won't do it himself.
The final word from the spokesperson for the greatest mass murderers in modern times. They have slaughtered, since they declared this war against terrorism on 9/11, at least 10 million, mostly Muslim people. And they're still claiming that they're worrying about a few deaths in Syria. I mean, you couldn't make this crap up. You genuinely could not make it up.